good evening. Good to see everybody tonight. Somehow, some way, we have wound to the end of another fall semester. Everybody here at least is upright and functioning, so I guess it wasn't too bad. We have come to the end of our honors evenings. This is our sixth and final one. Some of you have been to every one, or virtually every one. We appreciate that very much. Appreciate your support of our honor students and also the program. And so as we close the semester study this evening, we remember that. We appreciate everybody. And as typically, we'll have our two presentations tonight, followed by some questions from our panel and also from the audience. We'll welcome that. We'll some questions at the end. Tonight we have our two presenters from the state of Texas. I asked them at the beginning of the night if we could really handle that, two presenters from the state of Texas. I guess we can. One had to go first, and so that's Todd Hounshell. He'll be speaking to us first tonight. He's a finance major. He'll be speaking to us about the interrelationship between psychology and dealing with failure, particularly in business administration and business machines. Caleb Schmidt will be presenting second. He'll be presenting to psychology and interdisciplinary aspects of psychology and atheism. We're fairly confident that Caleb will not take the atheistic side of the argument, but just in case, we have a Bible professor tonight that can tackle it if he approaches that. So Todd, why don't you come forward and get us started tonight.
Good evening, y'all. Thank you for coming tonight. It means a lot that y'all are here and able to be here and listen to my topic tonight of failure. This was an interesting thesis to me to take up and to talk about. I was kind of intrigued by it because why do we fail? What is that about? What does that mean? It's something we're all confronted with. And so how do we interact with that? And it's something that's very studied in the field of psychology, but also the business as well. And so Thanksgiving was recently, and I was talking to my family. And I'd say, I go up to almost each and every family member, I'd say, hey, how did you fail? Now my family doesn't talk to me anymore. Why are you talking to us like that? It'd be weird. So what is failure? Cambridge simply defines it as this. Failure is the lack of success or just to not succeed. If you do not succeed, if whatever endeavor you're in and you don't reach the goal of success, then you have failed. It is simple as that. That is the definition of failure. And how does it impact us? What does it look like? What's going on in our bodies whenever this is happening? We can first look at the brain chemistry. So first things first, a study was done on collegiate tennis players. The neurotransmitters in the body were studied, and for those it was testosterone and cortisol. So whenever a player would win their match, they would experience rising testosterone levels compared to their counterpart who had lost that match. Cortisol levels were not correlated with winning and losing. However, if you had a higher seed or seeding compared to those who were lower seeded, then you had lower cortisol levels compared to those who had a lower seeding. And then another observation or another example that can be made of neurochemistry and what's happening in our brains is found in lobsters. So lobsters like to fight. And whenever they're fighting and they're quarreling and they're debating over dominance, there's a winner and then there is a loser. So whenever a lobster wins in a fight, it will seemingly strut about and have a more domineering posture in comparison to his losing counterpart. This is mostly due to because of the high levels of serotonin and then the low levels of octopamine in the victorious lobster, and then with the loser having the opposite combination. Serotonin levels are correlated with various conditions of mood and different bodily functions, but for most of us, we know it as the main neurotransmitter that is for depression. And octopamine is closely related to the fight or flight or norepinephrine mechanism. And so whenever you have higher serotonin levels, you're more naturally going to feel happier, and then with octopamine, with lower octopamine or higher octopamine levels, that's when you're going to feel more stressed out or in fear and having to flee. And then what we can see is a bias. So we see what our body is doing, the brain chemistry that's going on, but then humans are honestly naturally biased. We look on the gloomy side. We have a downside to our thinking. That's called loss aversion. Loss aversion simply means is that when a loss happens, it looms larger than its gain. So we naturally look for things that are going bad. So for example, in the business realm, the business world, or in our consumer world that we can see ourselves, whenever prices go up in the grocery store, we're more likely to view that and see that more prevalent than we will maybe a clearance or a decrease in a price in another item or similar item. And then, for example, in stock investors, in a portfolio with both losses and gains, the investor with the losses will view the losses as more prevalent, more important, more devastating than compared to maybe the increase in gains that may have been would have outweighed that. So say there's a 2% loss, but you had a 20% gain. The investor is more likely to look at the loss, the 2% loss, than the 20% gain that had occurred. So the question is, what do we do whenever we fail? How do we respond to that? How do we overcome that? And the answer is grit. We need to have grit. We need to have a little dirt in our eye when we get tough. That's what I might say. And grit is a combination of two things. It's passion and it's perseverance. So simply it's this. It's that you need to be emphatic about what you do. You need to have passion. And then whatever it is that you do, you need to be able to do it for long periods of time. Perseverance. And so in her book, Grit, by Angela Duckworth, she looked into all sorts of different topics and different organizations, who needed grit, what they would do in difficult situations, how they would fail, what happens when they would fail, how they overcome that. And so I encourage you, please go read this book. It is a great book. And she talks initially from National Spelling Bee finalists to pro football teams. And she examines how individuals become the very best at what they do and then what it takes for them to get there. And so whenever she's looking into that, she first looked at candidates and cadets at West Point. So whenever you're applying to go into West Point, you are given a whole candidate score. And so you're graded, you're analyzed based on this whole candidate score, which is simply your leadership capabilities, your SAT and ACT scores, and physical fitness. So there's three different main aspects. There's other things that go into building this whole candidate score, but this is how they seemingly rank you, quality test, if you will, just seeing how good you are in comparison to others, and if you are able to even make it into West Point. And so once you get to West Point, you have the 6-week induction training, which is called the Beast. It's tough, it's hard, they're trying to weed out the weak, they're trying to have the best of the best in West Point. And so he was wondering, okay, who makes it through West Point? You'd think, okay, they got a good score, they're already physically fit, they're smart, they're great leaders, and okay, they're going to make it through. They've got to. But Angela Duckworth came up with something of her own grit scale. And seemingly, you had to answer a couple questions. Basically, you need to answer, you would rate yourself as a self-assessment, if you will, about statements like, I'm a hard worker. I finish whatever I begin. I've overcome setbacks to conquer an important challenge, and so on and so forth. Statements that whenever you would have to personally reflect about, okay, where do I fall into this? Is this me all the time? Is this me none of the time? Am I neutral about this? Where do I fall into these kind of statements? And what Duckworth was able to discover was that her grit scale of basically she would take the answers that the cadets and the candidates would give her and she would quantify that and give it, and she would scale it and basically say, all right, you've got a grit scale score of 2.5 or 3.6. It's about a 1 to 5 or 6 ratio, 1 to 5, 6 range. And so basically, she would find that scale score and then basically say, okay, where's your whole candidate score? How does that line up? This person dropped out, here's their whole candidate score, and then here's their grit score. Essentially, when you had a higher grit scale score, then you were more likely to make it through West Point. If you had more grit, if you had more perseverance, if you were more passionate about what you were doing than other people were, you were more likely to make it through. And so we've got scientists doing their own studying, and so I took it upon myself to do a case study of my own for this thesis. And so I interviewed our very own Chase Clark. He's an adjunct professor here, and he is an investor in real estate, and he has a story behind him of his time spent in the business world, and he has come in very close contact with failure. He's been through it, he's worked through it, and he's been able to get through the other side of it and be successful in the business world and financially. And so, in 2004, Chase and his business partner were investing, they were buying up property, and able to quickly expand their portfolios and build up their property and build up their net worth. But, as we all know, March of 2008 hit. Real estate and insurance businesses crashed, the market came tumbling down, and essentially you could buy a house for 10 cents off a dollar of what it was worth. Everything had crashed, the market that they were in had basically disappeared. And so with a very small cash reserve and an inability to pay off these massive amounts of debt, Chase Clark had to short sell many of their real estate properties in order just to get some cash back in order to pay off some of these debts. But then he chose another route that most other people weren't taking, but was to start a property management company. They needed cash flow, they had families, they needed a way to support their lifestyle, to support the way they were living, and they needed money, they needed a means to live. And so Chase Clark and his business partner created a property management company. And in this, while everybody else was kind of buying up property, buying up assets, and trying to build up their portfolios, live out that real estate investor lifestyle, Chase said that in reality there was no other substitute ducking his head down and working. There was no other way to overcome what was going on around him than by simply getting to work and trying to overcome what was happening around him. And so, they started this property management company, and they were very successful in doing it. By their start in 2008 to the sale of the company in 2015, Clark had helped grow the company to its final value of nearly $12 million in just a few short years. And so after taking a situation from near financial woes and large amounts of debt, Clark had managed to help turn their economic woes into a state of financial prosperity. And so, as we've seen and as we know, business is tough. As we're hearing this year, it's hard to go through a situation like this. You've got a large amount of debt on your shoulders. You need to pay off loans. You've got investors. You've got financial needs that are happening all around you. And so what are the odds? What's happening? We need to understand what's going on in the business world. And we can see that in entrepreneurs and in small businesses. So essentially, the stats are that 9 out of 10 businesses will fail. No matter short-term, long-term, 9 out of 10 businesses are going to fail. 10% of startups are going to fail within their first year, right off the bat. And then if you're an entrepreneur already and you've had a failed business in the past, and then you start up another business, your odds of succeeding are about 20%. And so then let's say you have another startup that's successful, and then you start another one, your odds of succeeding are about 30%. And so there's a lot of obstacles that these businesses are trying to overcome. We could spend all night really just trying to name them all. But to name a few is simple matters of legality, quality marketing, a lack of organized operations, insufficient funding. The other external issues outside of the business that the business can't really control includes the politics of the country, the conditions of the supply chains, and then of course the overall global economy as a whole. And so one thing to understand is that failure is common. As we can see, 9 out of 10 are going to fail at some point in time. 1 out of 10 are going to succeed. And so in the business world, it's tough. It's hard to overcome that. And so the question is, what is failure? We define that, and then how do we overcome it? Is this. So 2 doctors of Lauren, I'm going to butcher this, Eskreis Winkler and Eilette Fishbach, found that failure threatened individuals' egos, which prevented them from wanting to get close to failure. They also found that individuals viewed the information that they wanted to gather from failure was more difficult to find. So first things first, our egos get in the way of our failure. Whenever we fail, one, we don't want to get close to failure. We don't want to even really touch it because it's scary. But then the question is we don't know how to learn from it. Because information is hard to find, so then how do we overcome that? Essentially, what these 2 psychologists are telling us is that you need to remove ego from the situation, remove yourself, your personal feelings, how you feel about it, what you want others to look at you as, and then you will be able to find the solution. Because whenever you're not thinking about yourself, what other people view as you, how this could hurt your feelings, if you're able to remove yourself from there, then you're going to be able to overcome that. Besides this, there were other research done by doctors at Temple University, and they were trying to understand how do you best mitigate errors in failure in different processes, even outside of the business world. And so one thing that they found was, the first thing is, if you're able to reflect on your failures, rather than just winning and focusing and reflecting on your successes, then you're going to result in a higher grit score. So they did similar tests like Angela Duckworth had, and they concluded that if you're able to look back on your failures and analyze them, if you're able to remove that ego and you're able to look back on them, then you're able to more likely result in a higher grit score compared to others. The second experiment that these doctors went through was they conducted to learn, and they showed that if you encourage other people to reflect on these past failures, then you're going to result in reduced error rates, specifically with tasks that require perseverance. So this is, I know it's a very broad statement, but essentially whenever you look back, and you're looking over your failures, then currently you're going to start making less errors in your work. So whenever you locate your problem, Einstein says whenever you're able to clearly identify a problem, then the matter is half solved. So if you're able to identify what's gone wrong, and you're able to remove that ego from it, you're already going to be able to start to mitigate some of the errors that you're making right now. And that's what I found was really the hardest thing about this entire thesis, was that how do you quantify, how do you measure something intangible as grit? How are we supposed to get more of that and gain more of this? Because as we learn, we can think about what we've already done, but like, how are we going to go and move forward? The simple thing is to, one, find what you're passionate about, and then think about what you're willing to persevere to get what you want. And that's really the question that we get and we're posed to as Christians, is what do we care about, and what are we willing to work through to get what we want, or to serve who we want to serve. In our walks of faith as Christians, we know what failure is because we've all experienced it. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, as Romans 3:23 states. We understand that failure does not define us, but God has created for us a new identity. God works to redeem us each and every day, and God's given us grit. He's given us the ability to overcome hard times, to work through difficult things, to become stronger than the times when we fail. He gives us opportunities to learn from our failings and work towards success, with all glory going to Him. Failure is difficult for us to learn from because of how we can get emotionally attached to our egos. Failure can be difficult for us to learn in business, but if we're able to get the hard work done and effort and put in the time, then we're able to overcome the odds that are against us. And despite how our body, brain chemistry, and even our mental frameworks interact to failure, with the correct outlook and the right amount of grit, individuals can overcome their failings. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. So how much of this, Todd, is adapt or die sort of a thing in business? Is that what the studies kind of come down to, how well people can adapt?
For the most part, it's about who has the best systems and will build the best systems to help them move forward and overcome the errors that they've already experienced, and who is able to adapt and learn and keep going.
And stick to principles they know are true. Mike, if you have a question, comment?
I did. In any of your research, especially about this idea of grit, perseverance, and passion, was there any indication of, I'm sure Duckworth probably took the view that that's more developed by your environment and your upbringing. Was there any indication that there's any biological or genetic factors that play into that?
For the most part, if you're looking at a nature versus nurture kind of argument, it really wasn't as much about nature as it was about who you were around. So in her book, she mostly talks about if you yourself want to become a grittier person and overcome some of the failings, is you need to surround yourself by people who are gritty. And then if you want to create a gritty culture around you, then you yourself need to become that as well. So if you're trying to make more people around you gritty, you need to build that gritty culture. And so for the most part, it wasn't a lot of, she really didn't peg a lot of it on biological, like mechanisms or anything like that. For the most part, I would say it was just from a nurture kind of perspective.
She put an emphasis on having more experienced people around you then, that would certainly help.
She did place a large emphasis on families. So she would analyze pro football players from the Seahawks. I remember she analyzed a quarterback from BYU. For the most part, she was looking at what was your practice schedule growing up, how far did your parents push you, what were their standards, what kind of were like the words they used to build you up, to criticize you, to critique you, and kind of things like that. For the most part, she really put an emphasis on the people that were around you more than necessarily the biological mechanisms within you.
No? Question?
No question really. I appreciated what you presented, and I think that idea of grit and having passion and perseverance in your lives is very important, especially for our lives as Christians. And I really appreciated how you kind of brought it all together with the biblical message at the end.
I thought it was really interesting when you talked about looking back on your failures and learning from them, because I think that's really important no matter what area of your life you're in or what kind of failure it was. Was there anything specifically that any of the research that you saw said, like ways to reflect or like things that you should look at, like, I don't know if that makes sense, like specific ways to look back on your failures that made you more successful, or was it just the act of looking back and trying to learn from them?
A lot of it, what they emphasized was mostly just step by step. It was really difficult for me to like work through this because it's very broad, like it's very broad terminology, and it's also like, as we're saying, like something that's almost intangible. Like we can see the results of what people with grit are doing, but they're like, okay, but like, how do we quantify it? How do we measure that? Besides a self-assessment. And so for the most part, what the psychologists were saying was like, whenever people are able to look back and look into detail, not just be like, oh, I failed, I did that. It was whenever the individuals were going in and looking at the situation and picking apart exactly what they did step by step, where they messed up, and where they kind of went off course. That's when they were able to find their solution. But for the most part, the biggest thing was removing, what the psychologist found was removing the ego entirely from the situation. Of, okay, I don't really care what people think about me. I don't care about how I view myself in this moment. I just care about understanding that I failed. How do I get past this? How do I overcome this?
It's the motivation in business is I don't want to lose money anymore, lose other people's money so they don't invest in me. But the critical self-analysis is the key, isn't it? And the humility it takes. Yeah.
So this is something that you might not have done any research into, but talking about the serotonin and octopamine like kind of system and how that relates to failure and perception of failure, did you see anything that discussed how antidepressants or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors might affect that process of reflecting on failure?
I did not. So like for the most part, I didn't find anything about like what you're saying about with antidepressants or anything like that. With the work on lobsters, that was straight from Jordan Peterson, the Scoville's Life book. For the most part, what he's talking about there is when you look at the structure and the stance of the winners in comparison to the losers. So whenever you look at a winning lobster, they're going to have naturally better posture. They're going to be more, they're not going to look hunched over compared to the losing one. And so for the most part, is what he was talking about there was whenever you win, you're naturally going to feel better. And whenever you naturally just put yourself in that winning posture, you're naturally going to increase your serotonin levels. But I didn't see anything about any antidepressants or anything like that.
You mentioned that the definition of grit is like a combination of passion and perseverance. So does this imply that if I'm not passionate about something, I'm more likely to fail? And then if so, is that something that can be learned? Like, can we consciously decide that we're going to work to be more passionate about something so that we're more successful?
I kind of struggled with that too when I was looking into this, because a lot of it for me is like, okay, sometimes discipline is about doing the things that you don't want to do, but doing it like you love it. That's what I've heard some people say. And so like, I think that's something I was wondering too, going into this is like, okay, what if I'm not like all that passionate about it. And what's interesting was how she phrases it in the book is she looks into a lot of like Olympic swimmers and things like that. And so kids who have been doing this their entire lives, things that they love, and specifically like, and not just that, but also in artists and writers. And it's kind of interesting, like, okay, like what if there's something a math homework assignment or a paper I don't want to write? Then how do I get through that? Because I'm not passionate about it, but I'm willing to persevere. How does that work? I'm not sure. I didn't get much out of my research out of that.
So can you coach yourself, is what you're asking? Can you give yourself incentives to finish something you really don't want to do? You probably can, but you're not gonna repeat it, are you? That's why I only took 2 math courses in college. I figured out what I didn't want to do. All right, go ahead.
I don't really have any questions, but because like I was kind of thinking about like my question was going to be like how like we can specifically like develop grit, but I feel like you kind of touched on it, that it's like almost this intangible thing. But thinking about like it being a combination of passion and perseverance, I feel like helps. And then kind of like with what Caroline was saying, like I feel like you can keep breaking it down within, okay, how do we develop passion, but then sometimes we can't completely define that, and sometimes it just does take that discipline, so, but yeah.
And I wanted to go into more of that further whenever the psychologists are talking about ego and removing it, and they notice it, how that's the biggest problem that's holding people back from failure is the ego. And specifically, not necessarily just that, but also self-concept too. In that, like, people want to save the concept of themselves, the image that they view themselves, their self-esteem, and so they don't want to look into that. They don't want to really think about that too much, because if I look too much into my failure, that's going to mess up the concept or the way I view myself. And so I think that's what was like, that was kind of interesting to me too. It was like, why don't we look into that more? Well, it's because we don't really want to hurt ourselves when we're looking for it.
With businesses and corporations, and we've got some people here who can speak to this more precisely, but to really get a great gain after a terrible loss usually takes a change in a board or a CEO, doesn't it? For that very reason. Because you've got to tear out what was there and replace it with something else. It's very difficult just to shift who you think you are. Apple is an example of that. Luke, almost forgot you.
Well, one thing that struck me about your presentation was at the beginning you were talking about how, you know, we have this increase in like serotonin and testosterone and some of those chemicals when we succeed, and then a decrease in them and a rise in stress when we don't. And then you touched on the fact that winners seem to repeat, right? Like a 10% success rate for someone just starting out, but then if they succeeded in the past, a 20% and a 30%. Do you think there's any correlation between that biological feedback we get from winning and then our tendency to continue winning after that, and vice versa?
It was interesting that you said that, because a lot of the research, specifically when they're looking at the collegiate tennis players, for the most part, it's not like, okay, I win one time in Pee Wee football and I've got high testosterone for the rest of my life. Like, no, it's not that exactly. But like, essentially, it's that whenever you win, what they found was whenever you go into your next match, you're more likely, your resting testosterone is slightly higher than it was before. And so it's kind of like, it's one of those things, and I really wanted to touch on this hindsight bias, now I didn't put it in my paper, but the Matthew principle that a lot of people like to talk about is that to those who've been given, much more will be supplied, and to those who have less will be taken away. And so kind of like, then people are like, okay, that's scary, because like, okay, if I lose, I'm just going to keep on losing. It's like, okay, but that's not what grit is about. It's about you're able to change that despite that. And so I think that's what it's like. I didn't see a lot into that, kind of like, okay, is it a positive, negative feedback loop? But for the most part, you're seeing changes in testosterone levels. And so like, say you have, just because you got low testosterone from losing the match before, doesn't mean you can't win again. But it's just saying kind of like what your levels are at and what's happening in your brain as that's happening.
Something else, Luke? You good? How about background here, sir? Any questions, Kevin? Sir? Anna? No?
I wonder, this is similar to what Luke was talking about like the natural effects that accompany a failure or a win. Specifically, you gave the example of the stock market, and so I'll just continue that. You said someone would be more likely to look at a 2% loss, and focus on that than like a 20% win. And that's just like the biological, like instant perception of that. If you logically know that, yeah, it's a 2% drop, but then it's gonna go up, are you able to override that biological thing pretty quickly, or is it just gonna stay like that even though you know what's going on?
Because that's like the biggest thing is that, okay, loss aversion is just a bias. So for the most part, like, yes, we're inclined to that, but for the most part, we can kind of choose that. Also, like, whenever we're made aware of it. And so, like, that was something I was wondering, because that's originally the route that I wanted to go in, specifically with this thesis was, okay, what's happening on our stock market? Like, we're seeing, how does this explain things whenever we see a drop, when we see a double down, and then things spike up again afterwards? I think that's what, like, I was kind of curious of, but for the most part, I didn't gather too much information about it.
But that is true. I mean, what do you find? When the stock market dips, what are people going to do many times?
Get rid of it.
Oh, get rid of it. It's counterintuitive to buy when things are low. It's a herd mentality in a sense. So this goes to some of that. Michael, something?
Just a comment, sort of going along with that, a lot of it seemed like grit has a lot to do, and at least being successful specifically in business has a lot to do with persevering the right things, not just simply persevering like when you interviewed Mr. Clark, as the market was going back up, he didn't do what everybody else was doing, buying cheap properties, he did something different that made him more successful in the long run. So, that was an important point that you brought up as well.
And to add on to that, like, it's also, and then on the flip side too, is also being passionate about the right things too. Of like, if you're, I think a lot of it of whenever, I like the examples that you use of the Olympic swimmers for the most part, and their training regimens and the lifestyle, like Michael Phelps, he would, get his 8 hours of sleep a night and get a 3-hour nap during the day, stuff like that. He's burning ridiculous amounts of calories, things like that. And so for the most part, he's persevering on the days he feels tired, he doesn't want to keep going, but then also he's passionate about, and he's emphatic about the things, the little things in his regimen, the right technique when he's swimming, the right calories he's eating, the good sleep he's trying to get, things like that.
We can be fooled into thinking that we're gonna bat 1,000, right? We do certain things, and that's just not true in life. Charlie Munger, y'all know the name? Died at 99 yesterday. He didn't bat 1,000, but he was highly successful because he stuck to core principles. And that didn't mean everything was gonna turn out perfectly every time, but it kind of goes to this: how are you gonna overcome? What do you have to overcome internally even to keep success more constant than failure? Questions from the group? Sir?
Going back to the passion question and what you were saying even there, we tend to hear the word passion and we think emotions. The examples that you're using are clearly, you said something about, fighting through it and doing it even when you don't want to. The swimmers are clearly not always emotionally happy about what they're doing, even though they are continuing to do it. Did the book make that distinction explicit, that passion is not emotion? Or is it just kind of implied in the examples and things?
So whenever, I'll read what she said here about passion, is the degree to which someone works with distant objects in view, the active preparation for later life, working towards a definite goal, tendency not to abandon tasks from mere changeability, not seeking something fresh because of novelty, not necessarily always looking for a change. And so like kind of going off of that is, she says both. And so it's like, okay, I'm very persevering, but I have no passion. That's not gonna get me anywhere, because I'm like, okay, I'm willing to do whatever it takes, but I don't really care about what I'm doing. Or I really care about this strongly, but I'm only gonna do it for a day or two. And so like, I think that's what's important is, one, emphatically about the right things, but for the most part, it's more like, it's just like a slow burning flame. It's kind of the way she describes it. It's not like an all, we can see that kind of in our spirituality and our spiritual lives as well. It's not like an all at once thing of like, now I'm passionate about my faith, now here this moment. It's a slow burning flame. I'm willing to care, I'm willing to persevere each and every day.
Thanks.
Something else? Nothing from the business department. Explains all the incentive. Right? All right, well, thank you very much, Doug. Our second presentation, again, by a fellow Texan,
is Caleb Schmidt. Caleb's going to present to us tonight about the intersection between psychology and atheism. Caleb studied this a good bit, part of his work through the course of the semester. So Caleb, come on up.
Good evening. I want to thank everyone for their time in coming out tonight. I'm excited to dive into this topic that I've been researching. So, research in the field of psychology of religion has shown that theistic thinking is fundamentally innate and universal to humans. Humans naturally tend to think in a way that assumes the existence of God, afterlife, and intellectual design and meaning. This thinking is due to several underlying cognitive systems that inherently promote theistic thinking and innately cause one to understand the world through the lens of theism. Regardless of time and culture, every human society has thought in a similarly theistic manner. It is apparent that these cognitive systems, which underlie theism, are in place from birth. However, given the rise in atheistic thinking in modern times, and considering this normative nature of theistic thinking, the question must then be considered, is atheism inherently unnatural? Within science, and particularly psychology, atheism is the dominant school of thought, and is considered to be more rational and scientifically pure compared to theistic thinking. So in this speech, I will examine the innate cognitive systems that make theistic thinking natural, the unnatural and inconsistent structure of atheist actions, attitudes, and beliefs, and the irrational manner in which atheists attempt to account for these contradictions. The research I will present unquestionably supports the validation of the claim that atheism contradicts the default and inescapable structures of human cognition, and that the acceptance of atheistic belief produces irrational and fundamentally inconsistent behaviors, thought patterns, and attitudes. Therefore, it can be asserted that theism is natural, while atheism is not. So first, it is essential to clarify what claims are being made regarding this statement that theism is natural and atheism is not. So in this discussion, theism is going to be defined based on three fundamental axioms. One, the belief in the existence of one or many spiritual beings or forces, such as God. Two, the belief in the existence of an afterlife. And three, the belief that the universe is intentionally created with design, which gives human life an inherent meaning and purpose. Atheism, therefore, is understood as the rejection of these axioms. Put succinctly, atheism is the lack of belief in supernatural or spiritual beings, an afterlife, or purposeful creation. Finally, the term natural in this context of the discussion describes a thought or action that does not require societal support or input and arises independently of cultural influences and social learning, meaning it is innate from birth and universal among all humans. So the prominent view within psychology of religion is that theism is made natural among humans due to several normative, cognitive, and mechanisms and processes. Further, it is believed that these cognitive features are innate and universal and have hardwired individuals with an inclination towards using theistic thought as the default mode of human understanding. Several cognitive features and systems have been identified as foundational to the human proclivity towards theism. Three of these cognitive systems that contribute to making theism innate and universal, which I'm going to be covering tonight, are psychological dualism, agency attribution, and teleological thinking. I will outline all of these to provide you with an understanding of how these cognitive systems underlie theism and how it promotes this sort of thinking. So psychological dualism refers to the belief that the self is composed of two separate and distinct realms and substances. This is often represented in the belief that humans are composed of both a physical brain and body, as well as a spiritual or unphysical mind or soul. Research shows that even young children intuitively assume themselves to be composed of more than simply their biological processes or physical bodies. The innate tendency to think dualistically causes humans to naturally think in a theistic manner, as this process lays the foundation for the belief that part of us will continue after our bodies have gone and move into an afterlife. Second is agency attribution, which is a tendency to anthropomorphically assign human-like emotions or motives to non-human objects and perceive even random environmental changes as being caused by a goal-directed entity. So agency attribution has been clearly demonstrated as being a natural cognitive feature, which occurs even in babies. Agency attribution, or the human tendency to attribute causality to natural events, combined with the proclivity to intuitively assume the existence of human-like agency, leads to the belief in the existence of supernatural entities which influence the environment. Agency attribution is therefore believed to be an innate and universal cognitive feature which supports theistic thinking as it produces the natural theistic belief in God or other supernatural entities. And the last cognitive feature that we will discuss in this speech is teleological thinking. This is the preference and reliance upon explaining the origins of humans or objects through a functional perspective. People intuitively seek to understand and describe the universe, objects, themselves, and others through the assumption that they were created for a specific meaning and designed for a predetermined purpose. Research shows that teleological thinking is natural and inescapable part of human cognition. Teleological reasoning directly influences theistic thinking by causing humans to assume deeper meaning in life and purposeful creation of the universe. People naturally view their lives as having self-evident worth, and people largely are unable to view the world as having arisen accidentally. This cognitive process is foundational to the final axiom of theism, which is believing in a purposeful creation and inherent meaning to life. So what we observe from these three examples is that several cognitive systems and functions naturally guide human thinking and promote and lay the foundation for theistic thinking. This means that theism is not only found universally among all humans, but is also innate. Humans are naturally theists. Now, having asserted the manner in which theistic thinking is psychologically natural, it's time to address the question of whether this makes atheism unnatural. Through observing the psychological research done on atheist thinking, behavior, and attitudes, we find that atheistic thought is indeed an unnatural form of thinking, which results in contradicting behaviors and inconsistent attitudes. Atheistic thought has increased heavily in recent history due to the rise in naturalistic explanations for existence, such as the Big Bang Theory or the evolutionary theory. And atheism is now largely been considered as a rational worldview, or the more rational way of viewing the world. However, significant evidence suggests that the constitution and motivation underlying many atheist worldviews are less than purely rational. Surveys of atheists reveal that a majority of atheists are former theists, and find that their rejection of theism is less often about a rational search for truth than it is a rejection of their parents or society at large. Further, the claim that atheism is grounded in a rational search for truth is not supported by research that shows that atheists show a greater intolerance of ideas contrary to their own, and are also just as likely to be dogmatic as theistic thinkers. Moreover, the claims of superiority made by atheists compared to theists are also contradicted by their observed behavior. Atheists commonly participate in behaviors and conduct themselves in ways which mirror theism, despite the fact that many of these actions are only logical and rational for those who are actually theistic. Atheists often associate with social groups and participate in ritual behavior similar to religious churches or rituals, and also engage in effortful attempts to spread their beliefs, similar to evangelism. Atheists appear to desire many of the structures built into religion and theistic worldviews, yet their engagement in these religious-like behaviors is not supported or necessitated by their worldview in the same manner that it is for theists. Finally, the inherent contradictions of an atheistic worldview are further reflected by their reflected on a subconscious and implicit level. The cognitively contradictory and unnatural assertions made by atheism requires them to exert much mental effort in resisting their own brain's natural cognitive processes. Studies show that atheists become emotionally aroused in the same way that theists do when reading statements daring God to do something awful to them. They also become more self-reflective and pro-social when primed with thoughts of God, and even experience the same amount of spiritual experiences as theists do. Atheists even have been shown to implicitly think that atheists are inherently more immoral than theists are. Clearly, atheists' thinking is only skin deep, and the implicit attitudes in atheists do not reflect their explicitly stated beliefs. As has been demonstrated, an atheistic worldview is contrary to the foundational cognitive systems possessed by human beings that make theistic thought natural. Moreover, the effort to oppose or invalidate the natural human system of thinking results in much internal conflict. However, it's important to not clarify what the assertions of this discussion do not mean. The naturalness of theism does not implicitly point towards the existence of God, nor is it an inherent invalidation of an atheistic worldview. Many atheists would actually agree with the statements I have made tonight regarding their worldview being and going against the natural pathways of human cognition. So the primary theory held by most atheists to combat the notions and ideas I have laid out is called the evolutionary byproduct theory. This evolutionary theory suggests that natural selection has accidentally promoted theistic thinking due to the evolutionary advantages provided by the cognitive systems that underlie it. It claims that cognitive features such as psychological dualism, agency attribution, and teleological thinking are evolutionarily advantageous despite leading to untrue or faulty beliefs. Evolutionary atheists believe that the exact cognitive mechanisms that are necessary for facilitating social cooperation, planning for the future, and providing an advantage for predicting or preventing threats and dangers have also had the secondary effect of making humans predisposed to theistic thinking and incapable of true rational reasoning. Many atheists assert that while it was once a beneficial lie for humans to believe in religion, it is now no longer necessary. They believe that because of the spread and advancement of science, humanity has now evolved past the need for religious thought in order to understand the world around us. However, the byproduct theory is logically and demonstrably lacking in many regards. Most of all because it is not an actual scientific theory. It is simply a story created to weave together circumstantial and handpicked evidence. The byproduct theory sounds like a good story to explain why we think theistically, but the claims it makes are no less supported by actual evidence than theistic belief. The byproduct theory uses the same cognitive biases it accuses theistic explanations of committing by unscientifically attributing and asserting large-scale meaning and causality based on mere observations. To take these observations and build an entire theory off of it, and assert that this theory is incapable of or adequate for disproving another theory is substantially unwarranted and an illogical leap to make. The existence of God is a metaphorical proposition that is inherently based on multiple domains of knowledge beyond just empirical evidence which is offered by science. Science can only provide us answers and observations regarding the physical world, and it is not designed to address metaphysical questions. Science is incapable of proving whether humans naturally think in a theistic manner due to the existence of God or due to evolutionary byproducts. Science was not designed or intended to answer this sort of question. The evolutionary byproduct theory, therefore, is not a scientific theory, but rather just an alternative story created to explain the origins of theistic thought that did not offer any real evidence or solutions to the fact that atheistic thought is cognitively unnatural. The theory also highlights the greatest problem with atheistic thought, their dependency upon science. Science is only capable of providing answers for physical and empirical observations. To answer questions of philosophy, morality, metaphysics, epistemology, to name a few, other methods must be employed. All these methods, however, rely on human reasoning and rationality, and atheists are restricted from using or relying upon them because, in order to be an atheist, you must first accept that the brain is faulty and unreliable, because you are asserting that your own brain's natural proclivity towards theism is a lie. Atheists then can only address theistic assertions on a scientific level because the essence of atheism is built only in scientific foundations and rejects any other form of reasoning towards truth. This limitation means that any atheistic belief or attempt at reasoning can only be considered internally consistent or objectively rational if it is possible to prove it directly by only relying on and fully adhering to the abilities and restrictions of science. Therefore, due to the multitude of inescapable contradictions within atheistic thinking and the restrictive nature of a worldview which rejects theism, atheism then can be labeled not only as unnatural, but also almost entirely irrational in its composition. This is because to truly and consistently be an atheist, one must first be able to fully accept the conclusions that atheism forces the rejection of theism and denial of inherent design or final cause.
2, atheism reduces humans to only physical objects and biological processes. 3, it necessitates the acknowledgement that cognitive systems are inherently faulty and prevent rational and objective thinking. And 4, atheism restricts reasoning to only the limited understanding of the world that is observable and provable through science. If one believes themselves to be an atheist and does not abide by these assertions, they are holding a worldview that is irrationally based and contradictory to its very core. Atheists must accept the fact that they are incapable of rational thinking, that their thoughts cannot be trusted, and that science is the only way to reason towards anything. They can only accept propositions that can be proven empirically or physically through science. Clearly, one cannot operate with a worldview this restrictive. Notions of morality, philosophy, ethics, to name a few, are all incapable of exploration under a truly atheistic worldview. However, atheism faces a greater problem than even this when we consider the nature of science itself. The atheistic reliance upon science additionally exposes a deeper, underlying contradiction that is unavoidable for atheists. This inconsistency is displayed in the fact that without the existence of belief in theism, science is actually not possible. Most fundamentally, the origin and preservation of a scientific focus and system requires an environment and culture where the pursuit of objective truth is posited as the highest moral and cultural value. Objective truth is the belief that truth and reality have an inherent, unchanging order, which exists independent from and outside of individual perception and subjective belief. The notion of objective truth can only be brought about as an extension of theism, because objective truth requires one to believe the theistic axiom that the universe has inherent design and meaning. Put succinctly, atheists' necessary dependence on science is to dictate their beliefs is paradoxically impossible in a culture where theism does not first prevail. Without theistic belief, science cannot naturally exist or arise, since its foundational rationale requires the culturally assumed a priori assumption and belief in objective truth. Science has only arisen in cultures which are first theistic and believe that the pursuit of objective truth will lead them to a deeper understanding of God. Without this cultural value and assertion, there exists no justification or rational basis for believing objectively derived facts and observations are more true than just subjective beliefs. Further, the necessary motivation or rationale required for extensively developing the philosophy and logically meticulous system that is required for scientific investigation of objective truth cannot arise without a theistic culture. This is why truly scientific systems have only arisen in select, few, and rare circumstances and times and places. Because objective truth is not deducible through science, atheists have no ability to prove objective truth is real. Because of this, the worldview of atheism is faced with the deep and inescapable fact that the entire foundation of their worldview and rise in modern prevalence must be credited first to the pre-existing popularity and success of theistic thinking in our culture. The foundation of atheism, which is science, is in and of itself an illogical system if you first can't presume the existence of objective truth. And objective truth cannot be proven without belief in a meaningful design to the universe and God. So in total, this means that atheists can only exist as a minority group within a theistic culture and society that provides them with the morality and ethics and scientific exploration of truth. This is supported by the fact that atheism is a highly rare and circumstantial thinking process, or form of thinking within human history, while religion has been resilient and universal throughout human history. Throughout history, every decrease in a religious belief within a culture has always been met with a rise in a new religion or resurgence of a former religion. But when atheism decreases within a culture or loses its culturally dependent foundations, it is not likely to return anytime soon. So as has been shown and displayed, humans are cognitively predisposed towards thinking and understanding the world around them in a theistic manner. Several cognitive systems lay the basis for theistic thinking and make this mode of thought innate, inescapable, and universal. The substantial amount of research that unequivocally supports this assertion makes it sensible and rational to conclude that theism is indeed natural. When observing atheism, the opposite is observed. Atheistic thought is shown to be contradictory and unsupported by the cognitive systems that allow for human reasoning. Despite claims of atheism being a more scientific or valid worldview, the motivations of those who accept atheism and the actions they participate in are far from rational. Research demonstrates that atheists' explicitly stated beliefs are unsupported on a subconscious level and contradicted by their implicit attitudes and behaviors. Atheistic thought is not only cognitively unnatural, but also makes it functionally impossible to believe anything or accept any truth. In order to stay consistent with their rejection of God, they must deny any inherent design to nature and must acknowledge that their own cognitive systems are inherently faulty and do not allow for rational thinking. In conclusion, this analysis of the cognitive foundation of theism and the structure and essence of atheistic thought and behavior demonstrably supports the thesis that theistic thinking is natural to all humans, and atheism is unnatural and an irrational form of thinking.
Well, I am relieved you got to that last point. Could we say atheism is its own faith? It's a faith of itself.
In a way, but it also is the absence of faith in anything. It's not really anything that they can hold to as having faith in. So it kind of doesn't have any foundation to really be its own religion or of the sort.
Better call it a cult?
Maybe so, yeah.
Interesting. Look,
Well, I really liked your talk. There's a lot that I probably comment on in there, but I've heard of the evolutionary byproduct theory too, and I stumbled on that when looking at a book called The Case Against Reality. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that or not, but his idea was that, like you said, like we evolved simply for survival and not to be able to detect truth. And so inherently we can't trust our senses, and so we can't actually get a grasp on what's real and what's not empirically. And but he was an atheist, and I think the way he kind of got around that was by basically asserting that we just simply can't know what's true, and not really trying to make any claim about there being a God or there not being a God. I didn't know if you had any comment on that or not.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because, I mean, that's kind of an agnostic form of, I guess, of just asserting that we don't know, right? And I think even still, if you're just going to assume that we don't know and that we can't think rationally or we don't know if we can, I'm not sure how you exactly operate throughout the world, because every action that you take, you have to have some sort of belief system in place that guides your direction and your motivation. And so if you're just going to say that you don't know or say that you don't have any beliefs, well, you're not actually going to live consistent with that thought process, because you do wake up every day, you go to work, and you do these things that require something to believe in.
I don't really have any questions, but I just thought overall this was really interesting, and I think like one of the first things I was thinking of is just like how like we are created, and a lot of these things you talked about, like they're in us from birth, and which I feel like also like it just all points back to God, because like it points back to there being some intelligent design, which we know is God. And I think like just the way we are created too shows that we all like desire to have faith in something, like kind of what we were saying, like even atheists at the end of the day want to put faith or hope in something, even though, you know, it's not the same as what we're doing, but everyone has that desire, and I think it just all circles back to like how we're created and how God created us. So. One of the points that I found really interesting was when you pointed out that researchers found that atheists have spiritual experiences and feelings of being in awe of something greater than themselves. So I was just wondering, did they mention what they attribute that to, or did they just deny it?
Yeah, it was kind of weird. I mean, it's obviously a self-report study where they're kind of asking certain questions and getting answers from the atheist. Usually these spiritual experiences, they attribute it to kind of to nothing, but their feelings of awe and something greater than themselves, usually ends up being something like awe of just how grand the universe is, or something like that, but really has no significant meaning. So it's interesting that they're experiencing these religious experiences or these feelings of awe, despite the fact that their actual stated beliefs wouldn't necessitate them having those. So
Would it kind of guide them towards almost pantheism or just worship of nature of some sort then?
well, I think you can definitely see that in kind of the Mother Nature idea. Obviously, with teleological thinking, even atheists have a hard time avoiding this tendency to assign some sort of moving force or guiding direction to the universe. There was a study that showed that even people who believe in evolutionary theory, they still tend to describe like natural selection as if it's like a conscious force guiding a species along in a certain direction.
Mostly just a comment. Kind of you're going off about like the contradictoriness of atheism and just how it inevitably is always just kind of leading to false thinking. And then I really just got me kind of how you were talking about with objective truth, and that it always ends up leading to that. There has to be something that designed this, that gives us objective truth. And I really like the comment that you made about most atheists used to be theists, and then the reason that they left that is because of either society or also like kind of their parents believe as well. And so I just got a comment, just like, the real question is then is, do they just even want to believe at that point? Is because of everything that's happened, or maybe the way they were influenced in their past, is do they even want to believe at that point in time?
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of grit, doesn't it? I mean, things will get tough in life. Why do people give up on God? Something's gotten difficult, and you just wake up one morning and it was like that. It's been a process, and then there could be a catastrophe or something, and how do you explain that? So, I think you're onto something there. Hannah?
So I had a question about atheists believing in like the theists' belief in God being a beneficial lie, and like human evolution and stuff like that. And I was just wondering if you could like explain how they think that it's beneficial, because the first thing that I would think of is it gives a purpose and it gives like a reason to keep living, which could explain like the survival of our species or whatever. But then why now is it not important anymore?
Well, so to answer the first part of that, you're correct in that their explanation for why it was a beneficial lie is mostly that, like for instance with dualism, the belief that leads to the belief in the afterlife, that's viewed as a beneficial lie to atheists because it causes us to seek to provide for ourselves and our future generations, which if that type of thinking process was promoted, it would then lead to more survival and greater like wealth. And with other like teleological thinking that your life has a meaning is obviously going to make you maybe work harder at things. And religions can also lead to social facilitation, bringing everyone together under like a united idea, which would obviously be advantageous. But now atheists kind of hold the position, not to speak for them, but that now with science and other things, we can understand actually the deeper truth to reality. And we don't need these religions because through social like evolution, we can create our own society that's stronger. This leads to kind of Marxist ideas or things like that. But
It does, it becomes a constant revolution because there's no such thing as truth anymore. And we've referenced this earlier in the semester, what Lewis talks about as men without chest. So, now, it becomes a loop, if you like. Sir?
Yeah, well, it seems like a lot of this argument hangs on the existence of an objective truth. What would you say to an atheist who justifies their life and their beliefs by asserting that there is multiple subjective truths and their personal truth justifies how they live?
well, I think if that is your belief, then science is completely irrational, because the whole idea of science is to seek out what the objective truth is. So it has all these methods and everything built into the framework of the scientific system, that are made towards discovering the objective truth. Now, if you reject the objective truth and say that it's all subjective, then I'm not really sure what methods you have towards reaching truth other than just what I think is true. And then if that's what you think is true, I'm not sure how you really operate through the world. You know?
Marcus?
I just appreciate how you pointed out that, at least with many influential atheists, their commitment to atheism seems to be predicated on a priori commitment to something else. Like Richard Dawkins said, you know, even if there was zero evidence for evolution, it would still be the best theory. Richard Lewontin said, you know, sometimes science has to reject very clear pictures of design and findings that indicate intelligent design because we've made a commitment to materialism beforehand. So very influential scientists, very smart people, but basically coming right out and saying, a lot of this isn't based on reason, and it's not based on, it's really predicated upon a mistrust in objective truth, like you were saying, which, like you explained, leads to mistrust in everything. So I just appreciate that you pointed out that it's really based on something before a commitment to atheism.
It kind of gets to what's the attraction? I have nothing to believe in, and it's a constant revolution. And I can't be sure of anything. What's the attraction of atheism? What don't I have to do anymore? If there's no objective truth, what don't I have to do anymore? What does it free me from? I don't have to behave, except by what I would choose to behave by. So, what else do you have, Michael? Another question? Okay, back around, sir.
Well, I guess one thing that occurred to me is that an atheist might say, atheism is a lot more inconvenient to believe, and then there might be some, I guess, like some weight to actually the belief if it is the more inconvenient one. Like, is that something that you've thought about? Or does that make sense?
I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that.
Yeah, so like, I guess like an inconvenient truth oftentimes might be seen as the one that is true because we don't really want to believe it after all.
Mm-hmm.
And so, this is that kind of...
Yeah, that makes sense. I still think, even if that is maybe an atheist assertion, I still think they have several problems that they haven't really addressed. So, it kind of sounds good, at least to say like, oh, well, I'm believing the harder thing, but at the end of the day, you are also believing the harder thing that has a whole lot more irrationality and inconsistencies built into it. So, I'm not really sure how that would necessarily validate atheism, but...
Do you find anything in your research that indicated like a certain time period or some prevailing events or philosophies that led to an increase in the holding of atheist thoughts, like the Enlightenment maybe, or Hegel and Marx's philosophy, or the sexual revolution, something like that?
Well, atheism is definitely rooted in kind of the advancement of science. So science begins within, at least within our culture, it's appeared at a few other places, but what we think of science is really only a Western concept. This began as kind of an exploration to discover the objective truth and discover more about God. And through science, it's kind of led to then, through like Darwinism and some other ideas, it's led to now actually kind of the destruction of religion, and that it's created theories like the Big Bang Theory or evolutionary theory that have now made God not necessary. So that's kind of been the direction that we've headed, but now what you're seeing is that now that we've removed God, science doesn't really have a purpose or a foundation. So it's kind of a self-defeating cycle.
Yeah.
I don't know if I want to say this. I thought you did really good, and kind of, this is just like a comment about what you were saying to Luke's question. But their way of thinking, it just seems like such a chaotic way to live, in my opinion. If you like sit down and think about how none of it really makes any sense, and it's just so interesting that most people who hold that belief don't really ever sit down and think about why that is what they believe.
Anything else?
kind of add on to what Luke was saying, like, with atheism, they're trying to, talk about inconvenient truths. I think also it's like, okay, is the inconvenient truth the objective truth that you're trying to ignore? And kind of like, going off what we were talking about earlier, is like if we're evolved only for survival, I'm not sure who was saying, but we probably weren't ever supposed to find out that the universe didn't have any meaning at all. And I think that's what's kind of interesting, is like if we only design just to reproduce and to keep going forward and live out our lives and that's it, then we probably shouldn't figure out that there's no meaning to it after all.
Carol? No? That's it? All right, any questions from the audience? Yes, ma'am.
Granted, the differences in the three cognitive phenomena that you were talking about between atheism and theism, how would you say that there's a difference in confirmation bias from that cognitive perspective for each side?
So how does cognitive or confirmation bias affect atheism and then theism? I think it definitely in some ways does play a part in both, particularly when it comes to whether you're accepting the byproduct theory or the God theory of why our brains work the way that they do. I think especially with atheism though, the byproduct theory is kind of just a story, an alternative story that you can tell that weaves together these parts of evidence and makes it sound good of like, here's why this happens. But that story itself doesn't have any actual support. So I think there's a lot of, when looking at the evidence and when deciding what's true or what's not, there's definitely on the atheistic side a lot of confirmation bias in terms of only looking at the parts that fit into their story and then assuming that the story is already correct.
I don't know if you're getting it, Angela, there's, if we're not careful, there's just that sort of bias on a Christian side of the argument. You know, we can artificially weight things on the other side if we're not cautious about that. We have plenty of evidence and plenty of reason for our faith, but we're going to be seen the same way if we don't take a legitimate position. So, well, the fundamental thing is that one of the fundamental things is they reject the supernatural, clearly, right? Because you can't confirm it. And that's what C.S. Lewis struggled with, you know, and so have others. So, what other questions from the audience? Dr. Ward, you want to speak up for the atheistic position?
No, I'm good, thanks.
What is the percentage of atheists now in this country, or did you read?
Nationwide, I believe it's, or worldwide, I believe it's around 7%. In America and other Western countries, it kind of depends. Obviously in Europe, it's a whole lot higher than America. America is one of the only first world countries that still is majority theistic, although what you classify as actually theistic may not be what we classify as religious, but.
That's interesting. Anything else from the group? Yes, sir.
Pick up on that point that you mentioned, atheists. Talking about demographics, one thing that I'm intrigued by, maybe you could help me think about in light of your project, is the rise of the nones, the N-O-N-E-S. You know, the recent polling shows that about a quarter of Americans say they're spiritual. You know, the rest of the phrase, not religious. And you dig into that, and there's been a number of studies, there's a significant portion of the nones, when they say they're spiritual, not religious, they mean they are atheistic, but they're spiritual. Now think about that for a moment, right? You hinted at this, that the atheists have a spirituality. That's actually a very significant point, because that is a growing segment of our population. Some of us in the room may be in that population. And I wonder kind of what you make of that population in life. Just take a portion of your paper, that first section that we've been talking about, the cognitive structures. I mean, just help me think about how you would talk to a nun about that. So for example, I'm a nun, let's say. And I say, you know, what was it, the dualism. I believe that in spirituality, there's a deeper sense of things. I don't believe in a God, but when I reflect inwardly, I have a sense of greatness in the world, which I think is beyond my sensory experience. And that's a part of what there's books on non-spirituality. And then the agency thing, you mentioned Mother Earth. I mean, even the atheist will make an agent out of nature, right? So they're playing in that cognitive. And the final one, the teleological, you mentioned, I could be a nun who's evolutionary, right? And you as you observe, survival of the fittest, that's a teleology, right? So I'm not trying to break down what you're saying, I'm trying to think through, if I'm a nun and you're trying to say, okay, our cognitive structures support theism. But what I'm hearing you say is that all the cognitive structures you describe support my experience as a nun. How is your project helpful to that segment of the population for whom we're in some sort of apologetic,
Well,
conversation there? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that sort of worldview would be, in some ways you're basing truth as simply just subjective. So I'm spiritual because my cognitive processes make me feel that way, but I don't really care what's outside of me.
Yeah.
And I don't care if there's an objective God or not.
Right.
And so it's a very, that worldview rejects the idea of objective truth in a lot of ways. And furthermore, I think in a lot of ways that's kind of a loophole of or a workaround sort of philosophy, in that it attempts to come to terms or rationalize the cognitive features that we have that point us towards theism, or it tries to help us find meaning or comfort in the world. But it also at the same time attempts to reject any of the responsibility that's placed on us by a truly theistic worldview. And so as Christians in this room, we believe in God, and we also believe that then there's a responsibility on our part as part of that. But in a spiritualistic sense, or worldview, or a nun worldview that you were describing, it presumes the existence of maybe something greater, but it doesn't really matter. And so I can feel good, but I don't actually have to do any of the work that is required by it.
Yes. I love the observation there.
And spiritual also infers that there's some objective standard somewhere that someone's yearning for. It's a matter of where that standard is and who is setting it, and am I gonna follow it? Relativism's only gonna take me so far. It may just take me like a one-engine plane that goes out right to the scene of the crash. That's gonna take me somewhere. And so the nuns have to make that decision for themselves. I'm spiritual. I'm choosing not to check a box saying what kind of religious flavor I am, but I believe in something. I believe in something. And that's gonna take me somewhere. And so I think that's where you start with. What do you believe and why do you believe that? And there's a better way to believe. So I think it's a great opportunity for us in a lot of ways. At least there's a spiritual recognition, something beyond this body. Yeah. I think it's good work. What else do we have? Any other questions, comments? Yes, ma'am.
I was just gonna make a comment. A couple of times y'all have mentioned nature, Mother Nature, the substituting something, spirituality, something, and just bring a little literature into this perspective. The 19th century British authors, a lot of them, there was a movement in that era to worship nature. Nature was the was the God, and a lot of that was brought about because they were reacting to the social injustices that they saw at the time around them. There's a lot of horrific child labor and abuses of children and so forth as the Industrial Revolution was getting in swing. But it was also a reaction to the hypocrisy in the church. And I don't mean necessarily the Lord's church, I'm using that in a more general sense. And a lot of the church officials were making money off of the abuses of innocence. And so these poets/philosophers were looking at this, and they were just rejected some of that. So what do you substitute? Well, it's something beautiful, something more grand, but it's nature. But that can only take you, as we know, so far. So it's just a observation. I had to bring my 19th century guys into it.
Well, it's relevant today because some would argue that we're moving to a new paganism
Exactly.
in the 21st century, and it's set those very sorts of critiques of established religion and culture that is
Exactly.
doing that. I think, I view that as right, actually, rendering intuitive taking error, approaching exactly what you described.
Anything else from you? Well, thank you very much, Caleb. Appreciate your. So again, thank you very much, Todd, Caleb, for guiding us through tonight. Appreciate the panel, giving us the questions, and again, appreciate everyone's presence. There is much going on at the end of the semester. There's always something going on in the semester, but particularly in the last couple of weeks. Appreciate very much your time being here tonight. We close this sixth and final honors evening, looking forward to hopefully a good break in just a couple of weeks. We wish you all well. Hope you travel safely, and we look forward to seeing you back in spring.